Okay, we're going to have the second of 7 presentations by Dr. Slaughter on the Maryland campaign of 1862. Go ahead and take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Okay, so this second presentation is going to concern the action immediately prior to the Battle of Antietam, that at South Mountain, Harper's Ferry, what sets those up, and the results of both of those. Some of the background information about the fighting that goes on there. Really, honestly, it's overshadowed by the Battle of Antietam itself, and probably for good reason. But both of these have a dramatic effect on what happens on the 17th of September, shortly after both of these battles. So a little bit of background information, then we'll talk about the battles and then kind of set up things to get toward the pivotal day of the 17th. A little bit about the situation in Virginia late summer 62. Pope's defeated Second Manassas with his Army of Virginia. McClellan is recovering from the Peninsula campaign and starting to trickle back in, but most of the army's coming back into the vicinity of Washington, D.C. by then. And it's a unique situation, really, in the Civil War. And what's going to happen in the late summer of 62 is that, by and large, we're going to see that the armies that are formed by Antietam are going to be those that are largely in combat in Northern Virginia, the Northern Theater of Operations, the Eastern Theater of Operations, in that vicinity until the end of the war. And what Second Manassas and the end of the Peninsula campaign following the 7 Days battles really do is they put Lee in a position really where he can strive for opening an offensive operation against the North for the first time, realistically. And he has some breathing room for once. There have been a couple of rather large federal failures because the Peninsula campaign obviously is as optimistic as it looks in the beginning, ends up failing, and then Second Manassas is a pretty critical defeat, maybe a little overrated, but still a critical defeat for the federal forces in the area. What is often really overlooked, and this is the part that always kind of amazes me. I think I understand why. Some of this stuff is a little bit, it seems a little bit boring. And much of the attraction of the Civil War has always been kind of the blood and thunder part. Certainly, it's what sells books. And a lot of the underlying military issues that tie into social, political, and economic means don't often really attract a lot of attention, but they're very important in understanding what goes on here. The Confederacy begins conscription in 1862. Now, there are many reasons for this. The obvious reason is the Confederate Army needs manpower. And it makes sense. I mean, we think about this in a modern sense. Most of us, I think, who deal especially with 20th century, deal with, look at World War I, World War II, from the U.S. perspective, things like Vietnam and beyond, the Cold War, the conscription in various NATO armies. And we really just think of conscription as an accepted and normative part of the process. But up until this point in American history, it really wasn't. And the Confederacy begins conscripting in 1862 actually for a number of reasons. Now, one of them is because they find they don't have enough people in the field army. But when you look at the underlying reasons for that, you start to see some interesting things. By the summer or early fall of 1862, there is already some evidence that the cause, as it were, is starting to delaminate a little bit. And what we see with the conscription in 1862 is the beginnings of the Confederate government to use what amounts to federal authority to solve its problems. This, of course, really kind of flies in the face of a lot of the post-war lost cause mythology and some of the pre-war beliefs, as it were, of the states in the South in rebellion that wanted to stick to more of a system of government that was much closer, really, to the Articles of Confederation. But it's really the Confederacy that first reaches beyond those bounds, beyond the, quote unquote, for lack of a better way to put it, rights of the state, and starts imposing massive federal authority to overcome its problems and its needs. Again, this is a subject really for a bit of a later date, but this is going to be something that's going to continue throughout the war. So, for instance, when we look at the lost cause mythology and the ideas and the ideology associated with that, one of the things that often comes up is, well, Lincoln was a tyrant. He suspended the Constitution. He suspended habeas corpus, et cetera. And what often gets left out of the argument is, well, yeah, but the Confederate government did the same thing. What the Confederate government's beginning to figure out by 1862 is something that they really should have already known. And that is that running a government is an effective government is a lot more complicated than it seems. And what they've done is repeated some of the problems of the early republic, and they're ending up with the same problems. They made some of the same mistakes. They're ending up with some of the same problems. One of the other big problems the Confederacy is beginning to feel by 1862 is a shortage of money. And this has a lot to do with the way they dealt with 1861. I alluded to this earlier in the first presentation. They really rather shorted themselves with the way that they treated the cotton crop in 61, especially when it comes to Britain and France and Europe. By 62, the lack of industry is really beginning to seriously affect the Confederacy far more than the Union. The reason being is very simple. The Union is able to expand its industry, and rapidly it starts expansion of its industry in 62 in response to the war, which it has the ability to do, but the South really doesn't. And although both sides suffered from a lack of material in 1861, it's going to start telling more severely on the Confederacy by 1862. So the ability to make any sort of war material, the South is trying, and to some extent it's succeeding. And some of the accomplishments are worth note, probably in a different presentation, really, about the South's attempt to resolve its industrial and logistical problem with its military. However, by the fall of 1862, most of the Confederate armies are beginning to suffer serious logistical issues, especially Lee's army in Northern Virginia. Now, those of you who are familiar with many of the the more recent works, really looking at Lee and looking at the Army of Northern Virginia, and really over the past 30 or so years, looking at the logistical issues that all of the Confederate armies face, but specifically Lee's army, are aware that this is a multifaceted problem. This is not just a production problem. This is actually often a delivery problem. And often what you'll find if we look at Southern logistics during the course of the American Civil War is that you'll find that there are various points where there is seemingly plenty of material. It's just not getting there. And there are a multitude of reasons for this, from basically the livestock that the Confederacy has to move the material. So, how many horses does it have? What do those horses do? Are they cavalry horses? Are they artillery horses? Are they going to be horses for teamsters? Whereas by 1862, you've got the Federal Army basically completely moving over to mules, but the Confederacy simply can't. So the logistic problem that's beginning to really show itself in 62, and it's going to get in some ways more complicated as the war goes on for the Confederacy, is not just a matter of production or acquisition. Often it's a matter of delivery. How is it going to get there? And then there's, of course, the problem that we could delve into, I think, on perhaps another night on the way that the states are distributing the assets that they have in a way that they see fit, according to a system that really is not federally in many ways functional. That leads into the issue of cracks beginning to form less than a year in. And these are serious cracks in the Confederate government and the Confederate military. And they are, again, multifaceted. This is not just a military problem, it's a social problem. So, for instance, even though the Confederacy begins conscription in 1862 to fill the ranks, so to speak, it's going to make exceptions. And one of those exceptions is going to be that so many men get to stay behind based upon the slave population of various plantations because they're afraid of a slave revolt. The other problems are going to be multifaceted and social. Men just deciding that, and you can start seeing this creeping into Confederate correspondence by 1862. A lot of people deciding, this war really isn't so much about our rights individually as it is about the rights of people to maintain their massive plantations and their property. One of the more interesting things that really pops up in this is by 62, 63, you start having some famines in the South. And when you look into the source of the famines, you find that, the South's having a very difficult time meeting its needs and feeding its army and its population. But one of the more quirky things that pops up with this is part of the reason the South's having a hard time feeding its population is because a lot of the grain being produced is being acquired by the Confederate Army not to make bread, of all things, but to make whiskey. And by 1863, you've got serious problems resulting in the beginnings of some basically bread riots and women on the home front in the Confederacy writing, telling their husbands they're starving. And when you get down to the root cause of it, a lot of it seems to be that the corn, the wheat, the barley, et cetera, that is being grown in the South is being used to make whiskey for the Confederate Army, which is something that doesn't get talked about a lot again. But these are big problems. Now, what is Lee or anybody going to gain by invading the North? And the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to take pressure off Virginia. Now, this makes sense from a strategic point of view, but this is also something that is very important to Lee. Lee is very Virginia centric to create perhaps create a term. I'm not sure if it's been used before, but one of the failings of Lee really is to think is that he doesn't think as much about the whole problem in the entire Confederacy as does Virginia. And that seems to be a problem that really finds its way or kind of inculcates its way into many aspects of the Confederacy as a whole. One of the other gains possibly by invading the North is it could possibly fix some of the logistical issues of the Army of Northern Virginia. Before the Maryland campaign, Lee begins discussing at length with the Confederate government in Richmond the serious problems he has logistically, not having enough clothing, not having enough ammunition, not having enough food, not having enough basically of just about anything to operate the Army, to make the Army function. So this invasion of the North is going to do two of these things. I mean, Lee was even aware, as was the Confederate government, that two of these problems might be fixed fairly readily by the invasion. Now, the next two are more speculative. Obviously, it could pressure the North to end the war. By this point in the war, you're already starting to see some negative reactions all around. We've talked about some of the Confederacy. You're starting to see some negative reaction in the North. The war's taking far too long. You have battles like Shiloh, and we're getting ready to have Antietam, that are incredibly costly, and people are already beginning to question on both sides of the issue whether or not this is worth it. And finally, one of the things that the South might gain from this, and Lee has this in mind, as does Davis and the Confederate government, is it might result in political recognition, meaning that specifically, and these are the two targets the Confederacy is already aiming at, Britain and France might see that this is a point where they can recognize the Confederacy, because if the Union can't, the federal government can't contain the rebellion, maybe it's advantageous for them at that point to acknowledge the Confederacy. And that's part of the thing that goes into this. Along with this, you're going to start seeing, and this really is kind of the pivotal point, a Union shift in war aims about this time. Now, Lincoln personally, and again, we talked about this in the first presentation, has always been really against slavery. He's preparing the Emancipation Proclamation before this happens because he understands that this actually might isolate the South. But he needs a significant Northern victory to pull it off. He can't just issue the Emancipation Proclamation without a victory. Otherwise, it might seem basically to be a desperate act. And he needs to make sure that he isolates the South internationally. And he understands that people are going to sell various things in the South, whether they're going to sell guns, ammunition, ships, luxury goods, whatever. But that political recognition is what they're looking for, and he needs to make sure they don't get it. And the Emancipation Proclamation is a big step toward that because it changes one of the war aims from, or the main war aim really, from the preservation of the Union to also an attack on the institution of slavery, which we discussed in a previous episode is an issue that Britain and France both care kind of deeply about. Neither side wants the war to drag on. By the late summer of 1862, it's obvious that this war is going to be considerably longer than either side thought it would be. And both sides are beginning to feel pressure to bring the war to an end domestically. Both in the Confederacy and the Union, this is beginning to drag on a lot further than they thought it would. And this shift in war aims is going to bring in different parties for the Union, but it has to be done on the heels of a significant victory and not just out of the blue. Lee heads north into Maryland. Now, if you're familiar with the Maryland campaign and the campaign the following year, when Lee actually gets all the way into Pennsylvania, these two plans look an awful lot alike. Okay. One of the things that Lee needs to be able to do is to screen his movement north using the mountains in western Virginia, specifically on the eastern side of the Shenandoah Valley, to allow his army to gain some freedom of maneuver and time ahead of the enemy. In this case, McClellan, who is coming to engage him because they know he's on the move. They just don't know what he's doing. And Lee has a couple of different things in mind here. A few, actually. Number one, as we previously discussed, what he wants to do is use an invasion of the North to take some of the pressure off Virginia. In the process of this, he wants to isolate and reduce Harper's Ferry. Now, Harper's Ferry had already been fought over a few times, just like Winchester will be fought over multiple times during the course of the war. Anything in the Shenandoah Valley or around the Shenandoah Valley, anything that's a point that's strategic, either waterways, railways, roadways, in that vicinity is going to be a constant bone of contention. There is a sizable Union garrison in Harper's Ferry. And even though the machinery of the arsenal has been removed in 61 and actually sent to Virginia, which is an interesting point. I mean, it's always kind of interesting to point out, the Confederate, the C.S. Richmond Arsenal that sets up in late 61, early 62, and is the single largest really domestic producer of small arms, specifically muskets for the Confederate military during the course of the war. All of that is made on machinery that was taken from Harper's Ferry in 61 and transported to Richmond. But Harper's Ferry itself, because its prominence at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers, is very important. And the Union garrison there looks like a pretty juicy target. And if he can knock that out, then he reduces part of the threat to his offensive operations in the north. Lee also desires to bring more Marylanders into the Confederate fold. Now this is Maryland is a border state. Maryland never secedes, obviously, from the Union. Maryland has very mixed sympathies, just like states, for instance, like Virginia do. And Lee thinks that he could possibly bring more Marylanders into the fold. Now, if you know a lot about the American political establishment during this point, Lee miscalculates this a little bit because the strongest Confederate sympathy in the state of Maryland is actually far to the east of where Lee is going to enter Maryland. It's not that there is no Confederate sympathy in what we might call central and western Maryland, but it's severely diminished, and a lot of this has to do with, again, topography. The eastern shore of Maryland tends to be pro-Confederate because it's broad, it's flat, it's agriculturally very productive, and there tends to be a large slave population there. As you move further west in Maryland, it's like moving further west in Virginia. There it gets mountainous, especially once you pass Hagerstown. Once you're past Hagerstown, it becomes very mountainous really rapidly. There's not as much demand for slaves in Maryland, even though it is a slave state, and the sympathy for the Confederate cause again diminishes more the further west you go. Kind of a rule of thumb: once you enter the Appalachians, even in the Deep South, you're finding the sympathy for secession is diminished, and this is one of the things that really falls flat during the campaign. To the extent that Lee wrote about this a little bit, that he did, some of the other people who were on his staff or in his army wrote about it after the war. It's a miscalculation. As a critical, no, but it doesn't yield him what he thinks he might get out of it. And there are distinct possibilities in Pennsylvania, and they're so good, and the possibilities remain so prominent that again, this prompts Lee the next year, 63, culminating in Gettysburg, to head north again, because taking the war out of Virginia, possibly resupplying his army, which he actually does a pretty good job of in 63, and creating a strategic threat that might result in the Union quitting the war, or at least being more susceptible to peace offerings, are distinct possibilities with this move. Now, important points about this. This campaign failed. And it fails before Antietam, which, again, the reason that I try to give a holistic approach to looking at these battles or campaigns as a whole is because often, we're distracted by the battles itself. So we're distracted by Antietam on September 17th, but, what else happened before and after that really makes Antietam happen, right? And one of the other things that we're going to see is that in 62, what Lee is doing is he's really kind of looking for that Napoleon style of victory. And in the ability, he breaks his army out into several detachments. He's sending them off in multiple directions, and he's running a lot of risks in doing so. He almost comes to disaster in the Maryland campaign. We'll get to that point. But, Lee is thinking in the terms of the day. Lee is thinking, that he can allow these various corps to operate as Napoleon did, to sustain themselves and then to basically bring themselves back together at key points. One of the interesting things that we see happen many times during the American Civil War and is that, the general officers on both sides, many of them, not all of them, but many of them were trained together. Many of them were trained to fight in the same way. Now, we can argue all day long as to whether or not there was any doctrine or not. Now, I would argue that, in a sense, there was. Whether it wasn't really put so much into a manual, but the way that the cadets were trained at West Point, many times they often fought alike. And there are various points during the course of the American Civil War where you can see the generals on various sides attacking kind of predictably and defending kind of predictably based upon what they previously learned. And with Lee's pattern, what we see is that Lee is going to constantly try, all the way from 61, 62, 63, when he has the ability to commit to offensives, to try these very complex maneuvers at high risk to his army, but they do admittedly have potential for high payoff. Now, one of the key events that happens during the course of the Maryland campaign is obviously Law Special Order number 191. Now, this is one of the great mysteries of the Civil War, perhaps the greatest mystery of the Civil War. Where did this come from? Many of you have probably already heard this story. Two soldiers from Indiana are wandering through a field, and lo and behold, on the 13th of September, they find this Special Order 191 supposedly wrapped around a bundle of cigars, sitting in a place where it couldn't possibly be missed if anybody's passing through the area. After the war, it becomes a sort of a basically a detective sort of a detective story trying to figure out whose order this was. It was lost. Longstreet says that after the war that he destroyed his. So it leaves a few possibilities, but the reality of it is we'll never probably know. One of the interesting things that I don't know has ever been examined, and putting this presentation together, one of the things that reminds me that I want to look into at some point is if anybody has ever done a handwriting comparison to see if it's possible to determine who actually wrote the order, even if we figure out eventually, which could happen, who actually wrote that order, who dropped it's a totally different question, and that part will never be solved. But this hands McClellan a very clear outline of what Lee intends to do in his invasion of the North in September. And of course, McClellan's famous quote that with Lee's orders in hand, if he can't beat him, he'll be happy to go home. McClellan, obviously, very controversial figure. We'll talk a lot more about him during the course of this series of presentations, especially during the battle and after the battle. But McClellan's already really kind of in pursuit of Lee. Okay, the Army of Virginia, the Army of Potomac, they know Lee's moving again, but it's finding him. Okay, that's really the issue. Order 191 obviously pops into, McClellan's hands, and McClellan makes adjustments to pursue Lee more directly. Now, this is going to result in the Battle of South Mountain and Harper's Ferry. Now, Harper's Ferry is already being contested, and McClellan knows that Harper's Ferry is already being contested. The Battle of Harper's Ferry is actually going to last from the 12th to 15th of September. So the battle actually starts the day before McClellan intercepts these, or is gifted, really, these plans. Excuse me. Part of the reason that McClellan is really so upset about this is because McClellan had been pestering the War Department since well before the 12th of September to give him the the garrison at Harper's Ferry and make it a part of his army for him to pursue Lee. The War Department refused, and what ends up happening makes McClellan even more incensed because that garrison, we'll find out, ends up basically being very ineffectual and surrenders almost in mass. Now, the reduction of Harper's Ferry, and the reason I call it really the reduction of Harper's Ferry, might call it a battle, but realistically, if you look at it, it's really kind of a siege. The federal garrison is basically trapped using topography and maneuver. So if you've ever been to Harper's Ferry, it's a beautiful place. I highly recommend you go. One of the things you'll see once you are down in Harper's Ferry is that it's in a bowl. You're surrounded by heights on every side. And what happens is that under Jackson, the Army moves in and surrounds Harper's Ferry on three sides, basically leaving the Federal Army at that point in control of the town and the outskirts of the town, but not in control of the heights around it. And they resist for about 3 days. There is a considerable amount of artillery fire and skirmishing, but at the end of 3 days, what you have is that the Union garrison surrenders. You get about 286 Confederate casualties. That number varies a little bit, but it's widely accepted as accurate. And almost 13,000 Union casualties because they virtually all surrender. You've got some dead and wounded, but it ends up being a surrender of the garrison. And realistically, if we look at Harper's Ferry, it's overlooked. I think everybody loves to look at Jackson. Jackson obviously was a gifted general, perhaps some people would argue the most gifted of the war, but it really is some of Jackson's best work. It's effective maneuver that isolates his enemy and basically puts him in a position where his resistance is really kind of futile, and that's why they surrender on the 15th. So those 13,000 men that McClellan wanted, which arguably could have been very useful to him, especially if they were in another position other than stuck down in the bowl that Harper's Ferry really represents, are effectively lost for no great effort and no great effect upon the Confederate Army. However, it is keeping Jackson and the men with him isolated and away from the main body of Lee's army. Now, South Mountain, which is another interesting battle that receives virtually no attention in the historiography, or very little. This battle is fought 3 days prior to Antietam, and this battle is in direct response to the lost orders that McClellan intercepted and was basically kind of gifted the day before. Now, McClellan is going to attack to disrupt Lee's movement north, okay? And again, if you look at this campaign and the Gettysburg campaign look so close together. I mean, the maneuver, the idea, the concepts, Lee's army and his various corps moving off. Longstreet is already moving basically toward Hagerstown. Now, if you're familiar with the geography again of the area and the topography of it, Hagerstown is not very far from either South Mountain nor is it far from Antietam. But the idea and the concept that Longstreet is operating under at this point is to move north further into Pennsylvania after passing through Hagerstown. And the mountain passes to the east of Hagerstown along South Mountain, which are Turner's, Fox's, and Crampton's Gap, are the gaps that need to be held in order to screen the movement north. However, this is where McClellan attacks. McClellan understands really as well as Lee does that if he forces these gaps and he gets into the valley where Hagerstown is situated, if you can imagine this in your mind a little bit, I have a map later on, but then all of a sudden that screen is gone and Lee's army is vulnerable to attack. And this is going to disrupt Lee's plans. And the Confederate forces under Longstreet are recalled at the beginning of the 14th to help hold those gaps. Now, it's going to take Longstreet a while to get there, and the forces that are in place at the moment are going to have to try to hold the gaps at South Mountain against McClellan's initial effort to start dislodging Lee's offensive in the north. It's Turner's, Fox's, and Crampton's Gap north to south. There are 3 of them. They're not very far apart. Turner's and Fox's are well within a mile of each other. Crampton's about 4 or 5 miles south of there. And all 3 of these are attacked to basically unhinge Lee's movement north. None of these gaps is particularly strongly defended. There are between about 5,000 and 10,000 Confederates actually holding each gap, and as the day goes on, they are strengthened over time, but they're strengthened while under fire. And the positions aren't particularly well prepared. They aren't particularly fantastic defensive positions, and there's plenty of room for the Federals to attack into the gaps. Jackson's still fighting Harper's Ferry. So, this is the 14th. It's going to be the day after before Harper's Ferry is completely reduced and the garrison there surrenders. And Lee is spread thin. So, excuse me. There is a small part of Lee's army around South Mountain. There is a small part of Lee's army with Longstreet. There's a small part of Lee's army to the south of South Mountain. And then there's a pretty sizable chunk of Lee's army over in Harper's Ferry. Now, in modern terms, if you've driven this by car, you might not think, well, what does that matter? I mean, it takes about 15 minutes or so, 16 minutes maybe to drive from Harper's Ferry to Shepherdstown, and then from Shepherdstown to Antietam. I'm sorry, to Sharpsburg. It's literally like an 8 minute, 9 minute drive. But in the terms of 1862, how long is it going to take to move your army there? And the road system is not as well developed, and it takes more time. And most of these men are moving by foot. Okay. And you look at Antietam in a modern drive. Well, how far is Sharpsburg or Antietam from Hagerstown? Well, the answer is not very far. You get on the interstate and you're there in basically 15, 18 minutes. But in 1862, it's going to take a lot longer to get there. And Lee's army is spread over this area. So if you envision in your mind, if you've been in that area, the Lee's army is literally spread from South Mountain to Hagerstown to Harper's Ferry, partially to Shepherdstown, and it's all over this area. And it's going to take time to communicate with them to bring them back in. Communication is not instantaneous, and transportation is far slower. At the end of the day, on the 14th, Crampton's Gap is lost. The southernmost gap is lost. And this is going to allow McClellan to penetrate that small series of mountains and move into the operational area that Lee is in his army. Turner's and Fox's Gap to the north of Crampton's Gap are threatened seriously. The fighting does not go very well there for the Confederacy. And what happens is South Mountain is a defeat. One of the more interesting things, again, about the historiography, we hear about Lee's defeat at Gettysburg. We hear ultimately about Lee's defeat at Appomattox. People argue and have argued for years about Antietam and what is it, we'll get to that. Is it a tactical defeat, or is it a strategic defeat, or is it a tactical victory on one hand and a strategic defeat on the other hand? But realistically, South Mountain is a tactical and a strategic defeat. And it's actually, in some ways, arguably, really kind of the key one. Because this is the Battle of South Mountain is really what stops Lee's invasion of the North. Now, Antietam caps it off, but South Mountain stops it. And this is quite obviously, there's no two ways you can look at it. This is McClellan defeating Lee at South Mountain, which we don't hear very often. And again, another little interesting facet of the historiography of the American Civil War. Okay. Lee retreats. So if you look at this map, you can see very clearly that you're dealing with, realistically, not many miles between all these points. But again, communications and transportation are very different in 1862. It's going to take time to bring these people in. It's going to take time to transmit orders, and it's going to take time to coordinate. And when your army is spread out over, if we look at it, 15 by 15, about 300 square miles, it doesn't look very good for Lee. Lee needs to consolidate his forces. He understands that he's outnumbered, and Lee is going to be outnumbered by the time we get to Antietam about 2-1. Lee is going to have slightly over 50,000 troops collectively, but not at one point, available when we get to the 17th. And McClellan is going to have over 100,000. Now, those of you who are familiar with George McClellan, at all points during his career, whether it's on the peninsula or whether it's here during the Maryland campaign, he's always going to think he's grossly outnumbered by any opponent he faces. Does that have an effect on the way McClellan operates? Well, surely it does. But the brass tacks of this moment are simple. Lee is outnumbered 2-1. His army is spread out, and his opponent has most of his army intact in one place. And this is becoming extremely dangerous. It's very dangerous potentially for Lee. McClellan continues to pursue his army, but there are very fluid possibilities here. The invasion has been disrupted, but that does not mean, and in the aftermath of this, when we start reading more about Lee's reports after the battle, it becomes really clear that although Lee knew his plans were disrupted and he knew he was in something of a dangerous position, it doesn't mean that he had entirely given up the offensive. And it becomes clear reading what Lee is writing after that he's seriously considering, even after the Battle of Antietam, continuing this. But it does stop any further northern penetration. And again, arguably, it's almost beyond argument. South Mountain is really what turns it back, and Antietam is really what's going to cap it off, but at tremendous cost. One of the things that again is very important to consider in all of this is simply that this is a culmination of a lot of issues going on at once. It's very important that the Union wins this because they need to have that significant victory. They need to eliminate the threat to the North, and they need to be able to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in order to distance the Confederate government from European governments acknowledging it. For the South, this invasion potentially solves a number of problems, anything from maybe convincing the North to quit the war to recognition of formal diplomatic recognition by other countries, and also solving a local logistical problem for Lee. But if we look at this campaign as a whole, what we see is there's a lot more parts to it than are typically considered in the historiography. Now, there are some excellent works, especially Hartwig stuff that is a little dense, but in hyper detailed, amazingly well detailed work on the Maryland campaign. But again, looking at this as a whole, what we see is a battle that culminates in Antietam that's far more complex than we typically discuss. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jamie. Outstanding. Let me open the floor to comments and questions from various people.
If you don't mind, do I have to raise my hand?
You can just chime in.
Okay, so quickly, you've mentioned this twice, and I assume you know that Lee is not made commander of the Confederate armies until April 2nd, 1865. He is the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, so the fact that he's Virginia-centered makes perfect sense. And another thing I would say, he is also surprised at how quickly McClellan moves at South Mountain. That's the reason he's spread out the way he is. He knows McClellan, and he knows McClellan doesn't move like that. And he will say that later. You know, when he finds out that his orders were discovered, like, D.H. Hill says that wasn't that important. And Lee said, oh, no, it was very important. And he will still show contempt for McClellan at Antietam, which we will get to, because he knows McClellan has this huge army, but he doesn't expect him to use it properly. And it turns out that he's right. So, just some minor disagreements, I guess I would call them.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think Lee, throughout the course of the war and what he writes after the war and what he writes more specifically after the various engagements, and to some extent the discussions that he has before the engagements, knows many of these officers, has either worked with them or fought against them at various points previously, and he does not expect McClellan to move that rapidly, but he does, and that's really the point of South Mountain. That with whether it's the American Civil War or any other war, people are only so predictable, and the model works until it doesn't. It's not that McClellan had performed, amazing feats of maneuver before this point, but he certainly didn't hesitate to strike Lee at South Mountain. And regardless of what the reason is, one of the things that I really find the most interesting is how South Mountain isn't often really discussed that much in the historiography. In some ways, South Mountain is really the key battle because that's what forces Lee back. Now, the action that's going to occur on the 17th, and then, of course, all the controversy regarding the follow-up of Antietam, what should have happened in the afternoon of the 17th, and then the pursuit of Lee thereafter. Again, we fall back into, what will McClellan do or what will McClellan not do? I think I've got a couple of interesting wrinkles to throw in there. about the 17th. Some of the newer stuff that's really popped up in the historiography recently that kind of sheds new light on what McClellan does or doesn't do on the day of Antietam. But again, it's not when somebody's predictable that makes them dangerous. It's when they do something unpredictable that makes them dangerous. And knowing somebody and alluding previously back to, a lot of these generals, a lot of these officers are trained in the same school, West Point, so on and so forth. They know how each other think. And it's when they depart from the mold of their personality often, or when it's when they depart from the mold of what they've been taught and predictability that they become especially dangerous. Alluding to another campaign that I find fascinating that I never can seem to read enough about is Vicksburg. Grant has a tough time at Vicksburg until he starts throwing the book out. And when Grant throws the book out at Vicksburg, he starts to make progress. So, and again, the personalities are fascinating. I think not just as Americans, but I know many friends overseas are fascinated by the American Civil War, and a lot of it has to do with the personalities of the generals. And one of the things I don't think I will ever get tired of, and the American Civil War is really kind of my secondary field. World War I, World War II, the interwar period specifically is really my primary field, is the fact that we have so many colorful personalities. We had so much material left over from personal recollections, and thankfully a lot of primary source material left over. And I don't think that these arguments and these debates will ever really end when it comes to the historiography of the American Civil War. Very good points.
Thank you.
Okay, Jim, you got your hand up?
Yeah, nice job, Jamie.
Thank you, sir.
And as far as I'm concerned, mastery of the Civil War is essential for an American military historian, period. End of story. And this is the way to do it, how to approach it, break it up like this, go through it very carefully. And, I commend you guys because that's the way to do it. That's how I envision we're going to do it with the stuff I'm doing. Now, I'm curious about, and Hartwick's book those books are really interesting books. I'm wondering what you think about Harsh's two books that also deal with this period. And actually, Harsh's books are sort of interesting. They deal with the whole strategic issue of the Confederacy at that time. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about some of the more recent books, like Harsh and Hartwell, I guess, is the most recent one.
Well, first off, let me say something. I am, from my perspective, I'm really interested in doctrine and strategy. Most of my work has been large scale down. One of the things that I started becoming interested in the American Civil War years ago was looking at the strategy and grand strategy of both sides, and then starting to dig down into the problems that both sides have. And I think that's something we often don't pay enough attention to. When it comes to operations in 62 and 63, and I would divide those up, and I would say there's a strong demarcation line there between 62, 63, and 64, 65 for some obvious reasons. I don't think we go far enough down into the weeds of what causes the strategic realities of the war at those points. And excuse me, I agree with you that looking at this from from a larger scale perspective puts a totally different light on the way we look at individual battles. Because if we look at, specifically just Antietam on the 17th, well, of course it has its effects, but the effects that Antietam has taken with all of the other operations that are going on at the time are far more dramatic and far more interesting, and they give you a much broader picture of that. And I think one of the things that I'm glad to see happening in the historiography of the American Civil War, especially over the past, really 20, 30 years, is we're really beginning to dig more down into those perspectives. And when we look at everything, when we look at campaigns as a whole, we get a much better picture of what's going on. And really, we understand the effects of those battles that we often focus on, for instance, Gettysburg or Antietam, whatever. or Vicksburg itself, or the battle specifically for Vicksburg. When we have that more holistic look, it really makes the battles make a lot more sense. And it helps us understand the entire context of it, and that's what the real value often is in the examination of it.
Yeah, well, I agree with you 100%. And my problem all the time with how Civil War roundtables conduct this, because the first time I ever went to a Civil War roundtable was in New York listening to Bruce Catt in 1961. And I was a kid. And my problem with how Civil War roundtables approach it is that, and we got a lot of people here who are very knowledgeable about the Second World War. All the kind of lessons we've learned from how to view campaigns in the 20th century, these guys, frankly, it's like out to lunch for some of them.
Mm.
And at least in the recent years, like I remember watching Gary come up as a historian, maybe in the 80s when he was coming up talking, Gary Gallagher, I'm talking about. I
Mm.
watched him transform himself a lot from sort of a personality-oriented military historian when he did his biographies to the broader kind of historian he has now. And I think that's the only way to approach the Civil War. Thanks.
No, thank you, sir.
Okay, Clinton, I think you had your hand up next.
Yes, thanks. I had a question. The background to the question is I have an interest in military incompetence and how some of these people get where they are. McClellan is, by some people, regarded as incompetent, but I'm not so sure he was. For example, with 191, that could have been a trap, and so you would stop and think. Generals don't often get so lucky that the general plan of the enemy is dropped into their lap. So his delay was probably could be explained by that. I just wondered, in your opinion, is McClellan incompetent, and why did he delay so long with Special Order 191?
That's interesting. I'll answer that in two parts. No, I don't think McClellan's incompetent. I don't think he was incompetent. Let me rephrase that. One of the things, and I think one of the things we don't really examine enough detail, is McClellan was a fantastic trainer of men. McClellan built the Army of the Potomac into the machine that's actually going to eventually defeat Lee. So he does have his very strong points. Is he, by all accounts, and if we look at McClellan as a whole, okay, from before the American Civil War all the way up through the war, when he runs for president, et cetera, so on, is he arrogant? Yes, he is. Is he overconfident at points? Yes, he is. But he's also not an idiot. South Mountain is a solid victory. Antietam, although, and again, counterfactually, and I'll bring up some of the more interesting recent stuff in the historiography and some of the reinterpretations of this when we get to the battle itself. Everybody always blames McClellan for not following up and crushing Lee immediately after, in the afternoon of the 17th, following the 18th, 19th, so on and so forth. Everybody did the same thing to me, okay? And, could he have done it? Well, maybe. But the fact is that if we look at this objectively, he actually stops Lee's invasion at South Mountain, really. And he does rebuff Lee seriously at Antietam that causes Lee to retreat back across the Potomac. So from an objective point of view, he just defeated Lee twice in 3 days. So is he an idiot? No, he's not. Would other people have done better? Maybe. But is he incompetent? No. Could he have fought those battles better? Honestly, the South Mountain, looking at it, probably not. The ability to deploy forces in that area is somewhat limited. There's not a lot of great defensive terrain, but then again, there's not a lot of great offensive terrain either. In a sense, if you're familiar with it, some of the fighting at South Mountain reminds me of the fighting at McDowell in Virginia. It's another not very well-known battle that Jackson fought in 1862. So people have probably treated McClellan too harshly, I think. He had very strong points, but I think part of what contributes to the negative opinion of McClellan is the fact he was a very arrogant man. And his correspondence about Lincoln was so harsh to somebody who's widely regarded by many people as the best president in American history and certainly a beloved icon of the United States, has probably done a lot to detract from his reputation. But incompetent? No, no, he wasn't. I don't think it's a fair assessment at all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Doug, you got your hand up?
Thank you. What can you say a little more about the relationship between McClellan and Lincoln, and maybe throw Halleck's actions in there as well? Is McClellan possibly more hesitant than he might otherwise have been because he's kind of getting shifting direction from above?
Oh, I think if we look at McClellan objectively, McClellan always feels like he's outnumbered. And I'm gonna throw out a very amateur psychological evaluation of McClellan, and I understand there are many people who would disagree with me, and that's absolutely fine. But when I look at McClellan, what I really see is somebody who is accomplished, obviously very bright. He's a very intelligent man. He's very good at many things. In a lot of ways, he's kind of a polymath. But what I think, if we look at McClellan's generalship, I think McClellan suffers from a fear of failure. And McClellan, when things are going well, still thinks things aren't going well. And it's kind of what I've seen sometime in many of my students. This sort of really confident exterior, but on the inside, this sort of, little spot somewhere down in their chest is made of jello. And I think that's what's going on with McClellan, is that he's afraid that he's going to ruin his almost perfect reputation, and he's waiting for the perfect moment from time to time. Now, he's aggressive at South Mountain. He's aggressive at Antietam. Does he use his army as well as he should? We'll talk through that. And the answer that's been given since 1862 is, well, maybe not. But that tension between McClellan and Lincoln really culminates in the election of 1864. McClellan's personal relationship with Lincoln is always poor. McClellan has no respect. Really, if you read McClellan's comments about Lincoln, there's no respect there. And Lincoln is clearly a very intelligent man. And McClellan is, I think, again, looking at McClellan's insecurities, I think McClellan is really intimidated by somebody in Lincoln who seems, on the exterior, somewhat simple and rough, whereas McClellan is anything but. And that very difficult relationship that he has with Lincoln, again, culminating in McClellan's defeat in 64, is personal, I think, to McClellan. And I think McClellan feels, and this is based upon what I've read that McClellan wrote, this is not conjecture. I really do believe that McClellan felt that Lincoln was his inferior. And I think Lincoln exhibited an extreme amount of patience with McClellan, considering some of the snubs that Lincoln was privy to, some of them actually directly to Lincoln, and not always verbally. And that contributes a lot to the difficulty. Now, in the follow-up of Antietam, which will be the last presentation after the tour in October, I'll kind of hit this a little bit more. And there's a possibility, I suppose, to develop even another presentation beyond that to talk about the historiography of the Battle of Antietam, which might be an interesting subject. But I think the tension there doesn't even culminate really it doesn't reach its apogee really until 64, long after McClellan's already out of the command of the Army of the Potomac.
That's certainly consistent with what other historians have said about them, and it's obviously consistent just with the observation that when McClellan was a subordinate of Lincoln in 1862, and he's running against him for president in 1864. Things have gone in the wrong direction between them.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's pretty consistent. I mean, realistically, if you look at the extant information on McClellan and Lincoln, that's pretty consistent. I haven't seen, and again, maybe I've missed something. It's always possible. I think all of us as historians are always kind of, what did I miss? But I don't think there's been a great change in the past 40 or 50 years of looking at that relationship and finding anything very new. And I think really honestly, the reason for that is because all of that laundry really came out in 64.
What I know has changed some in more recent years as we've concentrated more on communications, command and control, based on experience in more recent wars, is what role Halleck played.
Yeah, Halleck is going to be interesting throughout the course of the really honestly throughout the course of the war to a point. Um, Halleck has complicated relationships with a lot of the generals in the Union Army, and Halleck certainly, in some ways, um, he he's acting on behalf of Lincoln, but he's also in some ways kind of throwing his own influence and his own opinions and arrangements in there along the way too.
Well, the position he was in, it's hard to resist the temptation to do that.
Oh, absolutely. And Halleck has a lot, and he has a lot of rivalries with a lot of these generals that he's commanding. Really, obviously, and when you look at Halleck, I think it's fair to say that Halleck is sometimes getting creative with what Lincoln tells him or Lincoln's suggestions, and I think Lincoln's really not. Lincoln is not a micromanager, like we see, for instance, with various for Stalin or Hitler or somebody at points. Now, again, I'm not calling Stalin and Hitler consistently micromanaged, but at points they are. Lincoln is more of a nudger or a suggester, and he's trying to get his generals to basically do something, what he needs done. And I think Halleck is really where, honestly, Halleck is probably where some of the friction really develops between Lincoln and his generals
That's my guess.
Until you get to Grant after Gettysburg, when Grant really takes command of the whole thing, and Halleck is really, Grant really is running the show.
Yeah. Well, Lincoln, I don't know how much he exhibits it as a personality trait, but Lincoln was certainly very much aware that he had no combat experience. So he would defer to some degree to somebody with combat experience telling him what's going on. And then at some point, Lincoln, being the brilliant leader I believe was, and others believe was, would say, okay, well, you know a lot more than I do about a lot of things, but I know a couple of big things I don't think you're getting right. And he was able to say that, and he was able to make that conclusion in some cases when it was the right conclusion. That's, I think, one of the reasons why Elliott Cohen liked him so much in Supreme Command. He was very, very good, according to Cohen, and Cohen singles out 4 people he thought were especially good political leaders in wartime: Lincoln, Clemenceau, Churchill, and Ben-Gurion. And what he sees in common in those 4 is that they were really good at asking the right questions at the right times.
And I would tend to agree. Now, I don't want to go too far off into the weeds.
This could be another series. I understand.
Yeah, we could be here at 2 a.m. talking about that one.
We could be here till 9 o'clock several other evenings.
Yeah. And especially with all of those characters in particular, that could be a long talk.
Jim, did you raise your hand again, or did you?
Yeah, I just had a quick thing. And listening to this discussion, I'm going to have to track down where Stephen Sears is. I don't know if he's still around, but I can only think of his the most recent biography of McClellan that I think is really substantive. So I'm going to try to see, and I noticed he's still alive, so he's somewhere up in Connecticut. I'm going to go track him down because I'd be curious to hear what he has to say about all this.
Hmm.
Has
Okay.
anybody ever done a good biography of Halleck? I've never seen one.
Yeah, Ambrose. Ambrose did one long
Did he?
ago.
Okay.
Yeah, that was his dissertation before he decided to drop acid. Uh, well, people forget that he did that back in the. I mean, hey, a lot of people, a lot of us did that, but that's what that happened to him for a while.
And what effect did do you feel that had?
Well, he wrote his book on Custer and Crazy Horse. That was a product of his
Yes.
experiences when he was having tribal fun in the 60s. That was told to me by someone at OCMH many years ago. Anyway,
Well, it would make sense that he'd get interested in Crazy Horse after dropping acid because Crazy Horse reportedly got a lot of his brilliant inspirations for new tactics out of peyote.
that's correct. Very true.
I know how he got the name Crazy Horse, but that's another story for another day, I'm sure.
Okay. Mark. Mark, you got your
Thank
hand
you
raised.
very much. A very good, very nice presentation, Jamie. Uh, the Civil War is not exactly my expertise, but I have a question about McClellan based on two different things that I've heard about him, and I'm curious whether you agree with them given the current historiography. One, the bigger part, like you mentioned, McClellan was excellent at training and developing, building the Union Army. He was excellent at that. But and as another general was quoted, was that in order to be a really good general, you have to love your army and be at the same time be willing to sacrifice what you love, that army, for the greater goal, winning a battle or the war, and it's that aspect of generalship that McClellan lacked. And then the other thing goes back to an article I read a long time ago that McClellan was an American military observer during the Crimean War,
I see.
and that he had seen
Mm.
the French and the British bash themselves at Sevastopol and came out thinking, boy, well, these cannons and these rifles, the defense is really more powerful than the offense. And I'm wondering if those two things are still true, or still considered to be true about McClellan.
I
Oh,
think
I mean,
Patton said about McClellan that the problem at Antietam was he'd seen too much slaughter and couldn't take any more of it for one day.
I'll get to that, and Doug, I'll get to that comment a little bit when we talk about the afternoon of the 17th.
I'm sure.
There's some interesting stuff there that I don't think gets a lot of attention. To address the 2 points about McClellan, let me say this first. I don't pretend to be an expert on McClellan, but I really think with McClellan doesn't show a lack of offensive spirit during the course of the war. When he's in command, he goes after Richmond, the Peninsula campaign. He goes after Lee at South Mountain. He goes after Lee at Antietam. I really think, and this is my assessment of it, I could be totally wrong, but when I look at McClellan, what I see is a person who's afraid to fail. I don't know that McClellan is as embittered or disgusted by the bloodshed as he is thinking, "Oh my God, I might fail, and then what will people think of me?"
Yeah,
That's the read I'm getting out of him.
certainly plausible.
Not that he was over, because I'd heard again, actually specifically during the Peninsula campaign, that if he got five estimates as to how many Confederate soldiers were facing him, he would always take the estimate that had the largest amount of Confederates. That
Yeah.
he was consistently, and he always did that, so that he hesitated, he stalled,
Right.
he didn't do anything.
But again, to me, it's not that he's afraid to attack. To me, I think what it really is, and I could be totally wrong, but I really think it's a fear of failure. I think McClellan is so, he's very talented, and like a lot of very talented people, he has a pretty big ego. And I think that considering, McClellan's kind of meteoric rise even before the war in some of his endeavors, and then the the trust that's given to him, especially beginning in 62, I really think it's personal with him. I believe that he was afraid to fail and that he was always looking, he wanted to win, but he was always looking for the perfect fight. And when he did win, he wanted to make sure that he didn't lose afterwards. And I'm thinking at South Mountain and Antietam, now, again, I'm going to bring in some relatively new information, some new interpretations about the 17th that I think might shed a different light on this when we get to that point. I don't want to kind of, spoil it too early, but that's really what I see in McClellan. Not that his victories are Pyrrhic, because I really don't think that either South Mountain or Antietam really qualifies Pyrrhic victories, but I really think that that's what's holding McClellan back. I don't really think it's the bloodshed. I don't really think he's afraid of the bloodshed. I really think he's afraid of losing.
Well, Jamie, one thing I want to add in here is I remember when I read Fischel's book on Union intelligence,
Mhm.
which I found very, very insightful, because that really showed, that showed how McClellan was always in a situation where the Confederacy was overestimated.
Mhm.
And he was guiding his actions starting from the Peninsula Campaign on with these kind of, like, I'm fighting this enemy that outnumbers us. And that's the sort of thing I think is interesting to sort of speculate about all that with McClellan and how he's essentially accepting these intelligence estimates all the time, that he's outnumbered.
And I don't mean to, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think to give this since we're often in the realm of the counterfactual, I really think that something we ought to consider is that, okay, but let's look at if we look at other generals in the American Civil War at other times who know they're outnumbered and they attack anyway. That being outnumbered doesn't necessarily mean you're going to lose. Okay. Now, obviously, being outnumbered is a big problem, especially the wider the discrepancy between the forces you have available and the other guy. But it doesn't dissuade many generals from attacking. Obviously, to give Lee his due kudos and Jackson and other people, specifically Jackson in 62 and 63, it never stops them. And the accuracy of his intelligence reports one thing, and I know McClellan's getting his intelligence from all sorts of places, and a lot of it's really sketchy, and a lot of it's coming from private investigators who basically, what was it, not the Ball Company, the other
Pinkerton.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's reliable or not, but again, I don't think it's fair to categorize McClellan as unaggressive. I really think, and again, I could be totally wrong, but I really think what it comes down to is McClellan is thinking about McClellan. What will people say of me if I lose? It's going to tarnish my reputation. This is a kid with a 4.0 GPA who's going into, his senior year.
Yep.
He's taking underwater basket weaving because he wants to make sure that 4.0 stays intact. And I think that's really what's going on with him. And I could be wrong, but that's kind of my read of it.
Well, if you're right, that says quite a bit about the way that mentality has become pretty much institutionalized in the U.S. military now. Whatever you do, don't get caught screwing up. You can fail horribly, but don't get caught screwing up. That's not a really winning approach either. We did have generals, especially on the Union side in the Civil War, who were fearless in the face of reports that they were outnumbered. Hooker comes to mind, and that didn't work out real well for them. So there is reason for somebody, having seen what happened, or having seen some of the things that happened around him in the Civil War, to be err on the side of caution if you've got a range of intel estimates about what you're up against.
Well, that's true, but then
That's the dumbest thing to do.
But a counterpoint to that, I think, is be kind of Grant. And Sherman's, the best compliment anybody ever paid Grant during the course of the war comes from Sherman. He's like, Sherman said he doesn't give a damn what somebody's doing over the hill. He just cares about what's going on right here.
Yep.
That's a paraphrase. Obviously, it's not exact, but a lot of people had the ability to contain themselves and say, okay, look, this is the battle I've got to fight. I don't care what's going on 20 miles over. I've got to win this first, then I'll worry about that. And I think maybe, and I don't want to go off, but I really think maybe it would be an interesting point to really see, and I haven't seen a lot of it, some good psychological evaluations of the personalities involved in the war, especially on the generals. And to your point about the American military and, don't get caught screwing up, one of the more interesting points that I've read about American, military analysis over the past, say, 80 years and into World War II, and it's a critique, is that Americans spend too much time professionally, militarily, examining the things they messed up and not enough time looking at the things that they did right. And I think that's kind of part and parcel of that mentality. And so I think there's some sort of there's some sort of a synergy there between those things. What it is exactly, I don't know. But what I can feel is if I don't get careful, if I'm not careful with this, it's going to be another really long, lengthy writing project that's going to take me years to do.
Okay. Anyone else want to step up and ask a question or make a comment?
McClellan's always fun to argue about.
I think so too.
He's fun to argue about because as I used to say back when I was in high school in debate, somebody good can take either side of this and win.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay.
You can't say that about some of the others. There's really not much of a downside, for example, to Jackson.
Yeah.
Well,
Aaron, you got your hand up.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you all for a fantastic talk today. Yeah, it's really great that you've focused on all the tooth to tail components, and then just what Lee had to overcome, or at least attempt to. And I am wondering, the pre-Civil War, the education in West Point really did not have a very big formal focus on logistics, on support, on supply. I mean, that was something that was evolving for all large armies, or let's put it this way, that had evolved for the Napoleonic armies, but for some reason didn't seem to stick with everybody else in their education. I'm wondering if you have a perspective on that. I mean, just did we just have a sense that in the United States at that point that wasn't going to be our way of war, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s when we were educating our officer class. But once again, fantastic presentation. Really appreciate the time and effort you put in.
Thank you. I'm going to give you a two-part answer to this. I think, and the first part is, I think that the American experience during the War of Independence should have given the American officer class and professional education a very clear sense of how important logistics was, and the problems that a army could face. I think that the War of 1812. One of the effects of the War of 1812 is even Jefferson, who evolves from an anti-federalist very much into a federalist. Even Jefferson comes out and says, as much as I would love to see this amazing agrarian experiment succeed in the United States, if we're going to be a country that isn't going to work, we have to have our own industry because we keep going to war with people we buy everything from. Now, that opens another can of worms. But I don't think, and from what I've seen, it's not something that is particularly touched upon. I mean, if you read, for instance, if you read Jomini, who is more influential obviously more influential than Clausewitz in American circles until long after the American Civil War. he doesn't really dwell a lot on logistics. I think that I don't think that most people really start to pay attention to logistics realistically until World War One. I think it's a neglected field. It's not that it's not important. It's not that people like Napoleon obviously thought about the problems of, especially feeding people. Obviously, we get the canned food process from the Napoleonic Wars. I also think that other fields like intelligence, battlefield intelligence, tactical intelligence, really important. But how is intelligence considered otherwise? It's really not. Obviously, it's considered spying by and large in the 18th and 19th century, very ungentlemanly, very underhanded. And, up into the 20th century, you get into examples in France and Germany where in World War I, World War II, interwar period in France, military intelligence, even though they have an excellent intelligence network, is neglected. It's not a field that a lot of people want to go into, right? And I think that you're seeing the same thing with logistics. It's very inglamorous. It isn't really considered very carefully for a very long time. And I don't think that, in my read on what's going on in professional military education in the United States in the 19th century, it has more to do with mathematics, engineering, and tactical problems than it ever has to do with strategic or grand strategic problems, and virtually nothing when you start talking about looking at issues when it comes to, let's say, sociology and how that plays into it. So that is a very good point. And I really think that if we go back and look at it, it's a fascinating possible research project is to see how much they were being trained in that. And my bet is virtually not. It always seems like when we look at the American Civil War, look at the Army of Northern Virginia, it's always somebody else's problem. I'm going to go fight. You figure out how to get me this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not going to deal with it.
Yeah, but you know what's interesting about this, Jamie, is I'm going through George Washington's papers in the French and Indian War. And it's interesting because look at what goes on with him. And I know I'm talking to a bunch of Virginians down here. He educates himself because he has to practically learn how to administer the Virginia Regiment. And so all those papers are filled with practical learning experiences about how logistically to sustain a force. And that is forgotten, and he carries that in with him when he takes command of the Continental Army in 1775. But I don't disagree with you. It raises really interesting questions. I've never really seen good work done on this issue about logistics in the period before the Civil War, and it really is interesting. And of course, you're right about Yeomany. Clausewitz isn't even translated in English until after the Civil War. So it's really interesting to think about and how they were actually. Winfield Scott, though, of course, was a pretty keen student about this. I mean, he really learned his lesson the hard way. And he went to France. He basically bought all those books that were the initial basis of the West Point Library. So he was sort of, and Lee, of course, is by osmosis is around him. And Scott, when he does the campaign in Mexico, is most clearly concerned about logistics all the time. So it's sort of the practice of actually doing it is perhaps something how that translates itself into these officers is an interesting question. But a fascinating question, Aaron. Really interesting to think about.
Thanks so much. And once again, thank you all for doing this, putting this on. It's always a great effort that you do.
Appreciate it. Doug, you got your hand up?
I do. The Confederate leadership seems to have paid little attention to the potential importance of the railroads and the telegraph networks. They went into the Civil War with one steel mill in the South. Evidently, whatever people had learned about logistics, communication, command and control didn't sink in that deeply to their otherwise excellent military training. George Washington was this country's first spy master. There's very little material that anybody can find about what he left by way of instruction to others in how to train people in intelligence and counterintelligence. He was good at it. but he didn't train a lot. He didn't train people a lot in it.
Well, you bring up one point, and I think we've learned a lot. I think the United States, beginning in the 20th century, I'll put it that way, has learned a lot about strategy and grand strategy due to the Civil War. And the bringing up the issue of the Confederate railroads is interesting. And the importance of having a national organization that makes sense when the country goes to war that people weren't thinking about. So, for instance, in the South, I mean, if you know anything about and this is a very basic history, I'm not an expert by any means, but there are multiple gauges of railroad in the United States before the American Civil War.
Yep.
Now the states in the South were even more peculiar because one of the things that they would do is cities and towns in the South would sell the rights to the railroad on the south side of town to one railroad line and the rights of the railroad on the north side of town to the other railroad line. They would come in, and what would happen is you would force your passengers to get off the north, from the south, the train coming from the south going to the north, and you would make the northbound line arrange their schedule so they couldn't leave until the next day and vice versa. So that forced those people to spend the night in your town and spend their money in the town before they could leave the next day. And what happens is, since the railroad lines in a lot of these places, and you'll see all these railroad junctions in the South before the Civil War, they don't go all the way through the town, means that when the Confederate Army is moving its troops by rail, you either have to put new rail in that goes around the town or through the town, or you have to detrain all your troops on the north side of town, march them across town, and put them on another train on the south side of town to get them moving. Now I'm sure when the southern states that are going to eventually secede thought about this, they thought, oh, this is a great money making scheme. But nobody at the top, even let's say arguably even in D.C. before the secession crisis, was thinking, we're going to have a big problem if we have an invader. And we've got to start moving the armies around. We've got all these gauges, and then we've got these people with these money-making schemes, that are, making tons of money for the town. But what happens if we do have to use it? And again, that goes back to the fact that logistics is just almost completely neglected.
Same thing happened with highways all the way up to the 1950s, when Eisenhower, who had seen the effect of a scattered highway system in Europe, came back here and said, we need a highway system nationally that would enable us to move troops and material around quickly if we needed to. That's 1950s, not 1870s.
Well, yeah, and one other thing that we can't remember is that almost no railroads in the South were longer than 100 miles, and it really boiled down to the industries they had, right? So the industries of the South, which were, very focused on, cotton and certain goods that were plantation driven, which were all, clustered typically near ports or near major railheads or river basins. So you really did not have an integrated rail architecture. And so it was really a fundamental deficiency. I'll put a good little article about the from the Battlefield Trust about the railroads during the Confederacy. It's a massive limitation, but it just looks like fundamentally the South almost had a fantastical strategy, believing they could deliver a knockout blow, kind of their Barbarossa on the North, and they really didn't have a plan B or follow up to anything. And also just the way they never had an integrated command. I forgot who it was earlier that mentioned that. I think it was Doug. They didn't really integrate their commands till basically towards almost the end of the war. And I always remind people, that's because they were a Confederacy, right? Like that's not a bug. That's a feature of their software, right? Like I always keep reminding people, it's like, well, if they wanted the feature of all the things that Grant did right, well, you would join the Union to fight the South, So,
Okay, we still got people hanging on. Any other comments or questions that people have?
I think it might
All
be
right.
time to declare victory and withdraw for the evening.
I think we'll stop recording and then
Or Grant at Vicksburg, turn right.
I think I'll stop recording. And Jamie, thanks for a very good presentation.
Thank you very much. See you in a couple weeks.
Stuff.
See ya.